Interview with a Vampire Season 2, Episode 6, Like the Light by Which God Made the World Before He Made Light. I really wanted this episode to work because there are so many lovely individual moments. We're leading to what is the big time finale of the book, but this first episode just does not pull it together. The show changed too much of the book characters and plot and setting, but for some reason they're going back to the blueprint and trying to force these pieces into it to make it work and pull together into something cohesive. From my perspective, it's really confused and contrived. But let's dive right into those characters. Raglan James is back and still fun, talking about different factions of the Talamasca, and he's referencing trying to take it over or wrestle control in some way, shape, or form, even if it's a little bit jokey. If maybe we're gonna see the majority of the Talamasca come out and be against Raglan James's ideas and excommunicate him, and from there we might still get the tale of the body thief. They do a little jokey joke about his quote-unquote ability to steal bodies from the book in a way that doesn't really make sense, because if he and Daniel swapped bodies, that wouldn't give him Daniel's persuasive candor. It's also interesting because he says he doesn't want Daniel to ask the specific questions that Talamasca has, and you have to wonder why. Is it because they're not good questions? Is it because he doesn't care about them? Is it because he thinks that Daniel couldn't work those in a way that would be covert enough and it would end up getting Daniel killed? And I love that we come to find out that Rashid is in on the Talamasca thing. It's very fun because Daniel has been a huge asshole to this guy, and all along he could have had a buddy here in the Resistance if he'd been halfway decent. And looking at Daniel, it's fun to see that his ambition to make this book and to have this popularity literally has him trapped. It's fun for him to finally realize there are some stakes and some danger, and he has to continue to be who cares, arrogant asshole, but you can see that he's faking it and really kind of nervous and more aware of his position now. Moving into Armand, he is increasingly grasping for control. He follows up with Rashid asking if he ever left Daniel for even an instant during lunch. Why? What are these two vampires afraid of? Do they not want Daniel to leave before they decide he can leave? Do they have enemies that could scoop up Daniel? Do they think they're protecting him? This level of control implies that there's either secrets they're keeping from them, or a danger to Daniel, or a danger to them that they aren't revealing. Armand eventually realizes that Louis has regained his memories, and he's like, but you asked me to remove those memories. And I don't know if I believe that or not. It's not something we examine in this episode, and I feel like it definitely is worthy of examination. And also, this present day Armand seems legitimately remorseful and ashamed for what he did back in Paris. And I do have to ask why. Because if we go back to the book for a moment, Armand is the master manipulator. Lestat met up with him when he came to Paris. He told Armand all about Louis and asked for some of his blood so he'd be strong enough to take Louis back to America with him. And instead, Armand trapped and starved Lestat while he was getting to know Louis. When he couldn't part Louis from Claudia fast enough, he lets Lestat out, reveals him to the Coven, and then has the Coven separate the two of them, killing Claudia. He is later remorseful for how all of that went down, but it has nothing to do with him being sorry that he killed Claudia, and everything to do with how sorry he is because of how it affected Louis. And then moving into past Armand, he apparently doesn't like the Coven's art, which seems quite odd to me given how into himself and Lulu he was as a production. This play has a lot more substance than Lulu did. For starters, it's based off of one of the most popular absurdist plays in our history. But on top of that, the actual words that Santiago speaks are direct quote from the book Interview with the Vampire, and Louis is the one who says them. It's another time where the show takes a dig at all of the heavy conversations, philosophy, and thinking, the stuff that we all love about the books and that brought us to the show, insulting both to the fans and to Anne Rice. Also, it's quite odd to me that he says he's always hated this play, but he used to praise it and be excited about it when he was talking to Louis. This was an opportunity for Armand to open up to Louis and be honest about how he felt about the play and the weird position he was in with the coven, and instead he continues to wear the mask. And it makes me just more confused about the Armand-Louis relationship, because it doesn't seem like they have anything in common, don't really ever share their thoughts, feelings, or emotions with each other, and they're not vulnerable with each other. So what is the relationship besides a couple steamy scenes here and there? And makes it even more confusing to me that the two of them survive as a couple all the way to present day. And Armand, you let them write a play and put it on that didn't have any female roles? You were worried about Celeste and Estelle, and you're just letting them chill out and do whatever right now. That's very stupid. You're not acting like a smart 400-year-old vampire who's able to read people's minds. To be fair, your mind-reading abilities seem to only work when the show finds it convenient for them to work, which again, sort of like is a shortcoming to me in the show. Anne Rice was able to deal with these telepathic powers and the knowing and the not knowing without any difficulty. And it seems like the show can barely keep up with her ideas or concepts and is very like resentful of having to try to work them in some of the time. It is book accurate that Armand would never have made another. The Armand that we know from the books has only ever made Daniel. But I think it's weird that we have this moment of book accuracy because the reasons Armand had not made another vampire don't apply. Book Armand had this belief that was consistently proven true that every made vampire ends up hating and resenting their maker. And because of that, he didn't want to make another vampire. Additionally, when vampires drink blood, even blood from each other, they get glimpses of people's thoughts and emotions and feelings, and whether you're doing the drinking or you're the person being drunk from, you're getting those internal flashes. And Armand was like a very private person and didn't want to share himself in that uncontrolled way, so he didn't really go for blood sharing. And then I guess third, a little bit about how we can glean from Armand and his hunting. He just wasn't very like aggressive. He didn't revel in violence or creating more death or anything like that. He just saw it as a necessary thing he had to do to keep existing. And even with all of that opposition, Armand was down to make Madeleine specifically so that he could have Louis. He said, "I would have made this woman a vampire, but I thought it best you have a hand in it. Otherwise, you would not give Claudia up. You must know you wanted it." Interview with the Vampire. Armand would have made Madeleine confirmed. And over here we have Show Armand, who loves hunting and killing, doesn't give a crap about humanity, who loves Louis and would do almost anything for him. For some reason, just doesn't want to make this vampire, refuses to do it. His disgust in the show about making another is borrowed from Book Louis, but unfortunately Armand doesn't care about humanity and doesn't care about good and evil and taking of human lives, so it doesn't make any sense for him to be disgusted the way Book Louis was disgusted. And this is a scene the show did not need to include. We just do it and incorporate this confusing mixed up jargon, like trying to push different elements to different characters from the book into the show. A show that doesn't care about these ethical, moral quandaries about the reasons that people did certain things in the book. And all of that is fine, just don't include it. And of course, what does Armand actually choose when the coven gives him a choice? I guess follow-up question, did the coven actually give him a choice, or is this a thing he has to go along with for everyone's livelihood or whatever? And when Armand gets to Louis' house and sees that Claudia and Madeleine are gone, why doesn't he encourage the two of them to leave Paris too? He could have avoided all of this. There was no reason for what's about to go down to happen. And springboarding from there into the Vampire Coven. So I thought I understood in earlier episodes that the Vampire Coven is a group that cares about the theater and art and hunting together and their community and fellowship. So then I assumed that they would generally be happy that one of their own gets to write a play from the heart, a play of passion, and they get to act in it. And it's a much darker, more vampire-y, thoughtful kind of piece. Has a lot more artistic merit and value than Lulu does. Even if they're too far into the Santiago Rebellion to go back, which at this juncture I do think they probably are, this should create a slowdown in that rebellion, sort of an easing of tension. They're more or less getting what I thought they wanted. And I think that they would take pleasure out of having Armand sit there, listen to them, do do as they want, pleasing them and praising them, all while they know that they can have a revolt anytime they want. Having all this mind talk between Santiago and Estelle and Celeste, having them at the lawyer's office, having them wandering around Paris and stuff, and like seeing those scenes that Louis and Armand weren't present for, Claudia wasn't present for, so she didn't write about it in her journal or anything. Like, where are they getting this information from that we're now witnessing? I know there are the news articles about like bizarre thefts and stuff that they kept or whatever, and that's how they piece some of this together later. Not that it even matters where they got the supplies. But specifically the lawyer scene, I don't understand how they're relaying that information to Daniel, because I don't understand where they got that info to start. Also, I don't think it's necessary. I think not 100% knowing what's going on with the Coven is good. Like, just seeing them pass around the journal, seeing Santiago and some of the other Coven members give each other like sly looks, and knowing all the other stuff we already know is enough to get you where you need to go to get to this vampire trial at the end. I don't understand why the vampire troupe needed to do this trial with Claudia, Madeleine, and Louis. I know they didn't really like Louis, and they probably had a lot of resentment to Armand, so it makes sense they'd want to get rid of the two of them. But it's very weird to me that they included Claudia here, because she was one of them. Went out hunting with them, and she praised them, and she liked the same things they did and didn't like the same things they didn't care for. She suffered like them under the Matra. I guess the reveal of Lestat is supposed to be like a they had to kind of moment, but I don't know why they would have felt like they had loyalty to Lestat over Claudia, when I don't know that any of them had ever met or knew Lestat. I know he's like their patron founder or whatever, but I don't think that's a good enough reason for vampires to just fall in line, especially given that they're ready and willing to rebel against Armand, who's been there the whole time enforcing things, and is the other co-founder, apparently. Moving into Louis, he is incredibly mad at Armand, and I love all these little toxic jabs that they're getting in. It's interesting that as soon as Armand tells him he wanted to be mind wiped, he like backs up a little bit, like he automatically believes him and becomes a little uncertain. And I feel like we're getting a little bit of insight into Louis' psyche in this moment. Like, Louis has described his human self as someone who is doing a balancing act, who is never quite comfortable in any setting or ever really able to be themselves 100%, or like to truly and fully explore what that would mean. And because of that, I feel like they have a certain level of uncertainty or questioning. Through all of these years, it's like a core little kernel of them that they've never really been able to shake. As it is, aggressive art dealer Louis really reminds me of human Louis the pimp. Something I hadn't noticed in episode 4 is that Louis is really regressing back to like that cold, angry, domineering, like pimp kind of phase. He's sort of like trying to force that onto Armand so that Armand can like rule the Coven with like a conniving iron fist. You know, in season 1, we had like this big transition from like that colder, more closed off persona into like a gentler, more open person once Claudia was in the mix. And it was like a child he felt he had to care for, nurture, raise, share tender moments with. But I do think like this going back to this closed off, harder persona shows that he no longer sees Claudia as his child or a younger person or someone he has to protect at all. Like, he's entirely like pushed her off into the Coven and like alone to do her own thing. That family connection between the two of them seems to have been severed. Our last moments of it was when Louis was exploring himself and who he was through artwork, and the art dealer basically tells him he doesn't have an eye and does fine photos but not great ones. And that makes Louis really mad, but it also just 100% closes him off and makes him return to those roots of like the masks and the tough guy facades and the different person for different audiences kind of vibe. And where Lestat as a companion kind of like challenged him, like kind of forced him to face himself and to think about different things and experiences, Armand is so passive and like willing to please that he's just willing to go with it and like is totally fine with what's going on. And moving into the Louis-Claudia relationship, it's extremely dissatisfying. They're at their juncture where they're meant to part forever. And in the book, this is an incredibly heartfelt, tender, emotional moment. Here in the show, they feel nothing. They express nothing. They talk about nothing. It's awful. The turning of Madeleine, I was fine with that. It's different than what's in the book, but there's something emotional and interesting going on there, as well as like there's something going on between Claudia and Madeleine, which we'll talk about when we get to them. What they try to establish between Louis and Madeline is weird. It's especially weird because we saw Lestat turn Louis and then turn Claudia, and he didn't have any of these feelings or emotions or like phases he went through. So I don't really know what they're trying to get at. Likewise, when Armand's like, I know when it will get better. No, he doesn't know. He's never turned anyone. Like, there's just so much on the back end of this that they truncated. I think could have used more time, been more interesting to explore than some of the theater stuff that looks like it's not going to matter since Lestat is here to take everything over. Moving into Claudia, she starts with like this one thing for myself, and that would have worked for book Claudia, but it doesn't work for show Claudia because arguably the one thing she wanted for herself was being part of the coven, even though we knew that was incredibly dangerous. Madeline is like the second thing she wants for herself, a take two when the first thing doesn't work out. And speaking of Claudia and the coven, why did we just drop that? We had a whole episode with her joining, and then we had an episode with her as Lulu, but even that episode where she's acting on stage, she's not really interacting with the coven. I thought we introduced them because we plan to get to know them better, we plan to involve them more, there are going to be some interactions. Even with Louis not being interested in the coven, there should have been more interaction for Claudia than with the coven, but like they're just this amorphous blob that we forced into here. We put a connection to Claudia for some unknown reason, and then we never utilized. A lot of what we've seen from Claudia so far has just been very shallow, surface level stuff. There have been individual moments, but there's been no follow through or exploration of it, and especially something like the coven, which is completely different than the books, a brand new dynamic for us to look at. We don't do that. Why introduce it if you're not going to do something with it? And it makes me feel like we've wasted a lot of time in the show, which is concerning because as it stands right now, we're coming into what could be the last of Interview with a Vampire. They haven't confirmed a season 3. The whole Claudia Madeline thing, we've had a couple little snippets about their relationship, but it really hasn't been enough to build it to this moment. When we talk about Louis and Lestat building a relationship, we spent almost an entire episode. We don't get that episode between Claudia and Madeline, and I feel like we could have used it. It would have been great to show like equal representation. Their relationship is significantly more mysterious than Louis and Lestat's. This was like a huge moment for creativity that they passed by for reasons unknown. We also don't really get a good explanation for why Claudia doesn't want Lestat's blood in Madeline, what that means to her. It's a weird line. Like I said, I think it's only there to bring Armand into it, and why we brought Armand, I'll never know, because he was never going to turn her, and that whole I've never turned anyone from this version of him is very weird and off-putting. Also, Claudia's one line where she says like, I'm too small to turn someone is from the book. 5-year-old Claudia couldn't turn anyone, but that's not the case for this Claudia. She's pretty much the same height as most of the adults in the room. She could have used something like, I'm too young, my blood's too weak, I don't want to risk it. Those could have been like good lines for her to use, but the one from the book, when it's no longer applicable, all I see is red because it doesn't make sense now. Moving into Madeline, her character storyline makes me so mad. First, we had her having an affair with a Nazi because she wanted to. She sees the humanity in Nazis or whatever, like good for you, I guess. This episode, we see an attempted assault of her. Does every major female character in this show have to be either assaulted or almost assaulted to make it into the show? We couldn't have done something, anything else for Claudia to reveal herself as a vampire. Just off the top of my head, we could have had Madeline falling into some kind of obsession with Claudia, following her around, catching her doing kills. Or the reverse. We could have had Claudia so obsessed with Madeline and following her around and like accidentally revealing some supernatural something or other because she's like reading her mind and reacting. If we wanted to do something bloody, we could have had Madeline not be able to take her further ostracization and try to take her own life, and Claudia coming in to save her. Either stopping her from self-harming at like a peak moment, or like after she self-harmed, she puts a little bit of vampire blood on her to heal her wounds up and keep her alive. That's just off the top of my head. Obviously, book version Madeline doesn't have this issue come up. It's just like trauma, and it's a specific gendered kind of trauma when we didn't need to like repeat this same plot line or beat over and over again. There are lots of other things we could have done. I have a note here where I just wrote down that Madeline is a grab bag of bad choices, and it's so true. Like, you go from seeing humanity in a Nazi to deciding that you want to be a vampire and being obsessed with what drinking blood would taste like. She is a weird lady. It's working for what the show needs it to do. too, but like characterization wise of what makes a good vampire, what needs to be within a human to make a good vampire, it's saying some things I don't think you necessarily want to link together, because you started by using like the vampire as a metaphor for queerness, and now you're just like sort of making the vampire a metaphor for bad choices. How that links to queerness is not great. I guess you could be saying something about outsiders and whether you're born an outsider or whether you make yourself an outsider that makes you a potential candidate for vampirism. But again, the two things, when we like put them next to each other, like the queerness versus humanity and Nazis, like I just don't think you want those two things to stand next to each other, and I think the show didn't really think about it. I'm glad Madeleine and Claudia get a couple months before they meet back up with Louis and Armand. I'm sad we didn't get to see it. I really could have used more screen time with Madeleine, and I really could have seen more on-screen affection between Madeleine and Claudia than we got. Very disappointed about where we're at in the story. And then lastly, Lestat, he shows up in like the last 30 seconds of the episode. It looks like he is going to be the main catalyst for the trial of Louis and Claudia and what goes down from here. In the book, we come to find out that he was as weak and used as perhaps the vampire coven was in Claudia's death. His only culpability was really trusting Armand and telling him what had happened versus like actually orchestrating the whole thing and like masterminding it under Armand's nose, as we're being led to believe is what happened at the end of this show. I mean, we'll see. It's possible that Armand is orchestrating the whole thing and that's what we're gonna come find out. Or it is possible that like Lestat promised Armand something and Armand wants Lestat that badly that he chose that. I don't know. I'm both curious and upset at this juncture. I do think that there's still like a chance for redemption in what we've seen so far, but where we left off in this episode was very frustrating for me personally. There's not going to be any specific scenes, and I don't think this episode covered any thematic elements, so we're really at the end of my review for this episode of Interview with a Vampire. Talk to me in those comments down below. If you liked this episode, tell me what you enjoyed most about it and give me something to think about and maybe a new way to look at it. And as always, keep reading.